there, and welcome back to our next lesson for APUSH Period 5. I'm your APUSH Lady Boss, and today we're looking at military conflict in the Civil War, Part 2. We're looking at the course and conclusion of the war. Now remember, if you just scroll into the description here, you can find downloadable follow-along notes for you to help you make sure that you stay engaged throughout this video. So to start, we want to always focus in on our objective. Explain the various factors that contributed to the Union victory in the Civil War. So if we look at the College Board, the curriculum, this key concept really explains for us what we're trying to know and understand. Although the Confederacy showed military initiative and daring early in the war, the Union ultimately succeeded due to 1, improvements in leadership and strategy, 2, key victories, 3, greater resources, and 4, the wartime destruction of the South's infrastructure. So this whole lesson is going to be focusing on those 4 things right there. So, brief historical context, course of the war, a recap of the reasons for victory, and then the cost of the war. So, for some historical context, I want to just remind you where we're at. Now, if you missed the first lesson and you want to know more about comparing the Union and Confederacy, head back and watch 5.8a. But basically, what you want to be able to remember from that lesson is what were the strategies of both the Union and the Confederacy? What were their advantages or disadvantages? And a little bit about Fort Sumter. So the fact that Fort Sumter, the shots were officially fired. Lincoln called for a small military for a short amount of time. We see additional Southern states seceding. And 1861 is there's not a lot of military engagements, but we really see a lot happening in 1862. So I love this map because it shows where the battles of the American Civil War, where the military engagements occurred. And if you look, the darker the color, the further into the war it occurred. So this is really surprising. So for example, I teach in Minnesota, and many of my students, even by the time they're taking high school history, are unaware that there were military engagements in Minnesota during the Civil War. In total, there were nearly 10,500 military engagements in 23 different states. So I love how you can kind of see the course of the war by looking at this map. But what we're going to do is we're just going to really look at the first Battle of Bull Run. We're going to go through some of the other significant battles and what you should really remember for the APUSH curriculum. So the first Battle of Bull Run always grabs students' attention because, as you can see in this picture, there were literally civilians picnicking, like tailgating, to watch this battle. They show up with their cucumber sandwiches, champagne, and they are absolutely surprised at what they see. They expected the Union to just demolish the Confederacy, and that's how it started out. But then General Stonewall Jackson, as he becomes known as, resisted the onslaught, and the Union forces end up running for their lives. So really the lesson learned here is it's not going to be a short war, and it's not going to be painless. And so Lincoln responds to this war by calling for a much larger military and appoints George McClellan as commander of the Union Army. So we're going to divide the war into 2 separate theaters, the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater. So when we look at the Eastern Theater, they're really trying to accomplish the goal of capturing the capital of Richmond, Virginia, and blockading the Confederate ports. So there's a few notable battles there, depending on where you live or your teacher's preferences. They might emphasize different ones than this. The Monitor versus Merrimack was one with the first ironclad warships. But the 3 that you should be more familiar with on the Eastern Front are going to be the Battle of Antietam, the Battle of Gettysburg, and then the Appomattox Campaign. And the impact and results is that early and frequently there were Confederate victories. So 1862, if you check that out, it's all Confederate victories. The Battle of Antietam is technically a draw. The Union claims it as their own victory, but it's not until the second half of the war that we start seeing the Union start to gain momentum. Another impact is that the Confederates successfully pushed the Union away from Richmond, and they aren't actually able to capture this capital until the very end of the war. So now let's shift over to the Western theater of war. The Union goal here is to control the Mississippi River. So what we see happening over here are some pretty significant battles that had high casualties. So the Battle of Chickamauga had the second highest total casualties next to Gettysburg. And we do see a lot more Union success or Union dominance in this area. So a significant one will be the siege of Vicksburg, where the Union takes full control of the Mississippi River and achieves their that part of the Anaconda Plan, splitting the Confederacy in two. All these victories also end up bringing Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman into prominence, and that helps with changing the strategy of the war in the second half of the Civil War. So if we're going to look at a couple battles specifically, we're going to first look at the Battle of Antietam. So this happened in 1862 in Maryland, and what Lee is trying to accomplish here is gaining alliances from Europeans. He's still hoping that this cotton diplomacy, that their dependence on American cotton, will lead to their assistance of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Now, McClellan had actually received a copy of Lee's battle plan, didn't do much about it. And what happens is the bloodiest single day of the war, 22,000 casualties in just one day. Lee will retreat to Virginia, but does not pursue, does not take advantage. He doesn't capitalize on this. And he could have potentially ended the war right there in 1862. Lincoln does claim this as a victory, and what you want to remember about this is that he's going to use this moment to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. We're going to talk about this in the very next lesson, but the Emancipation Proclamation is really significant in part because it allows for African Americans to join the Union Army. And so about 180,000, 200,000 African Americans become part of the Union Army, which is just a huge advantage for the North. McClellan ends up being replaced by a more aggressive Ambrose Burnside after this battle. So here's a quote from a Confederate officer. Again and again, by charges and countercharges, this portion of the field was lost and recovered, until the green corn that grew upon it looked as if it had been struck by a storm of bloody hail. From sheer exhaustion, both sides, like battered and bleeding athletes, seemed willing to rest. Okay. Oh, and here's an image. The Civil War is known as a turning point in photography. It's used much more frequently, and so we actually have a lot more visual imagery of the Civil War when compared to earlier wars. All right, Siege of Vicksburg. So this happened from May to July 1863 in Mississippi, and this is part of the Union attempt to gain control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in two. The first attempt to take Vicksburg was a failure, but later in 1863, the Union is going to bombard the city for 7 weeks with heavy artillery, and eventually the city will surrender. This leads to the fulfillment of the Anaconda Plan and cements the reputation of General Grant. This is a huge turning point in the Western theater of the war. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg, this is known as the more official turning point for the whole war. So this is July 1863 in Pennsylvania. It is the bloodiest battle in the Civil War. In just 3 days, there were more than 50,000 casualties. This is the last time Lee is going to go on the offensive in the North, once again hoping that a victory in the North would force the Union into peace, or that it would help the South gain foreign allies. Once again, the Union general, this time General Meade, does not follow Lee to force the surrender, leading to this quote by President Lincoln: "We only had to stretch forth our hands, and they were ours." Here's some more information about the casualties. Now, Lincoln delivers his inspiring Gettysburg Address that many people in previous generations often had to memorize in schools. We'll talk about the Gettysburg Address in our next lesson. So the coming to the end of the war here, we've got Sherman's March. This is going to take place from November to December 1864 from Tennessee to Georgia. So this is where the Union is going to be more focused on a war of attrition, a war where they simply are trying to wear out the enemy. They know that the Union knows they have more resources in regards to manpower, weapons, ammunition. They have the advantage when it comes to strength. However, Southern morale and support is still extremely high. And so what Sherman wants to do is to shatter the strength of the Confederacy, which he believes is the material and moral support from sympathetic Southerners. And so we see 60,000 Union soldiers going on a 285-mile march led by General William Tecumseh Sherman. And it is the complete and deliberate destruction of Confederate territory and infrastructure. So they are destroying railroads, they are looting, they are damaging anything and everything that is supporting the Southern war effort. And this really did break the spirit of the Confederacy and destroyed its will to fight on. As well, as they traveled through this on this 285-mile march, they freed formerly enslaved peoples and they followed along this march with them. A quote from General Sherman: "The Yankees were not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people. Therefore, they needed to make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war." Here's an image for you where you can see the destruction. You can see the Union Army. You can see destroying the railroads. And then you can also see a group of enslaved people right there kind of following along. Okay, our last major battle and turning point that you need to be aware of is the Appomattox Campaign. So this took place from late March to early April 1864. The city of Richmond finally falls to the Union after a 292-day-long siege. Lee and the Confederates are going to flee the capital. Lincoln and Davis are engaged in peace talks, but neither one of them are willing to compromise. Lincoln will not allow the South to remain their own country, and Davis is not willing to give up on that. And so Grant ends up catching up to Lee, a little bit of a game of cat and mouse there, as Grant would catch up and Lee would get away. Small battles took place with high casualties, and eventually Lee says, "There is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Results, April 9th, 1865, is the surrender of the Confederacy to the Union. So now a recap of our reasons for victory. We see significant improvements to leadership and strategy when Lincoln goes from George McClellan as the major commander to Ulysses S. Grant being the major general commander. And so one of the issues with McClellan was that he wanted very long training periods and he was very reluctant to attack. In fact, his name was Tardy George. After just 5 months, he was replaced and then restored to a full command. Then after his failure to completely wipe out Lee after Antietam, he was removed again. Grant, on the other hand, had a famous quote where he said, "Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike at him as hard as you can, and keep moving on." He knew that the Union had more soldiers and could replace soldiers more easily. And so he was... people believed that they were way more likely to die under his leadership. And they believed this so intensely that they started putting what is like a early form of a dog tag. They would pin their names and addresses, their personal information to their uniforms, so that if their body was found but was unrecognizable, their family could still know what had happened to them. And so when we see the war shift from Tardy George to Grant, we see a more aggressive strategy happen, which was more effective in debilitating the South. Key victories. Here's just a reminder of some of the key things that led up to the end of the war. You should be familiar with Antietam. Now, even though that's a draw, it's significant because of the emancipation that follows after. The siege of Vicksburg, huge in the Western theater of war. Battle of Gettysburg is the last time Lee goes on the offensive. And Sherman's March, a great example of that total war. So those would be the 4 things that I would make sure to be aware of. Greater resources. This is a recap from the previous video, 5.8a. So if you need more information on that, go back and check out that video. But as you can see, the Union had more resources in every aspect except large farms. Finally, the destruction of the Southern infrastructure. The direct cost to the Confederacy in human capital, government expenditures, and physical destruction totaled $3.3 billion. You can see here some statistics. 40% of livestock killed, 50% of farm machinery wrecked, 11 cities destroyed, factories demolished, thousands of miles of railroad torn up. The South went from having about 30% of the nation's wealth to just 12% of the nation's wealth. Now, while this was essential for the Union to win the war, now that the war is over, that land is still part of the country. And so dealing with this destruction is going to be a major task for the United States. So our final concept here is to look at the costs of the war. This is the deadliest war in American history. Huge amounts of dead and wounded, and the estimated financial cost of $5.2 billion. Now, what's interesting is that actually significantly more soldiers died from disease than from actually wounds in the war. If you were in the Confederacy or the Union Army, you had about a 1 in 4 chance of dying. Additionally, the cost of the war will be Lincoln's assassination. So on April 14th, just 5 days after the surrender at Appomattox, Lincoln is shot in Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, who was a vigorous Confederate supporter. He will be found, I believe it's about 2 weeks later, and he will be killed. Lincoln did not die immediately, but he did die the next morning, and he's the first American president to be assassinated. So I consider this to be one of the costs of the war as well. When we think about what happens in Reconstruction, you can't help thinking about how would it have been different if Lincoln had remained in office. So I hope that this lesson helped you to understand this objective, explain the various factors that contributed to the Union victory in the Civil War. And if it was helpful, please make sure to like and subscribe. And thanks for watching. I'll see you for our next video on the government policies during the American Civil War.